Are you confused about the new Buyer Brokerage Service Agreement requirements in Washington State? Or maybe you're not even aware it exists. Today I'm diving into the essential reasons why signing a Buyer's Brokerage Services Agreement is a critical step in your home purchasing journey. Hi, I'm Lori Jackson, a seasoned real estate professional with Coldwell Banker Bain Realty in the greater Seattle area. I'm dedicated to guiding buyers and sellers just like yourself through the exciting, complex, and sometimes crazy journey of home ownership over the last 17 years. Some of you may be asking, what is a Buyer's Brokerage Service Agreement? Otherwise also known as the Form 41, in Washington State, we're now required to have an agreement with any buyers we are assisting with buying a home. It's required by state law and must be signed by all parties prior to even showing homes to a potential buyer client. So prior to January 1st, 2024, this was not a requirement. Starting on August 15th of this year, 2024, it will go into effect. The most significant change requires a buyer's agent broker to enter into a written brokerage services agreement with their buyer before or as soon as reasonably practical after a real estate broker starts rendering real estate services to or on behalf of a buyer. It is also required to contain certain provisions, which I will touch on. It is also important to note that real estate firms may choose to create their own service agreements. Using a buyer brokerage service agreement is beneficial to both the broker and the buyer in setting expectations, negotiating compensation, and discussing the broker's services. There are 3 ways in order for a real estate broker to get paid for their services to a buyer client. The compensation may be paid as published in the listing if it is offered to the cooperating buyer's brokerage firm, or it may be modified in the actual purchase and sale agreement by the buyer, the buyer's brokerage firm, and the seller. The purpose of the provision in the purchase agreement is to ensure that the buyer understands that the buyer brokerage firm compensation is to create an opportunity for discussion and negotiation and transparency in all real estate transactions. Listing agents that represent a buyer client that wishes to purchase a home from a seller that they are representing must also enter into a limited dual agency agreement with the buyer, as well as a separate written agreement with the seller, and both buyer and seller consent to what is called limited dual agency. The Buyer Brokerage Services Agreement, also known as the Form 41, acknowledges a section that clearly states that the firm will not participate in a transaction that is a distressed home conveyance, unless otherwise agreed in writing. A distressed home conveyance is a transaction where a buyer purchases property from a distressed homeowner and allows the distressed homeowner to continue to occupy the property and promises to convey the property back to the distressed homeowner, or promises the distressed homeowner an interest in or portion of the proceeds from a resale of the property. The Form 41 addresses and outlines the buyer brokerage firm name as licensed, the buyer's names, the geographical area where the services will be provided from the broker for the buyer to purchase property, the term of the agreement as number of days. The form defaults to 60 days if nothing's filled in. If for some reason either the buyer or the buyer's brokerage firm desires to terminate the agreement, it must be formally done in writing as well and agreed to by the buyer and the buyer's brokerage firm. Say, for an example, the buyer or the firm's agent decides that the relationship is not a good fit for them. They may choose to unilaterally terminate the agreement. Limited dual agency and compensation is also addressed on the Form 41. The firm and buyer must agree on the compensation for the buyer brokerage services. If the firm is acting as a limited dual agent in the transaction, there are a variety of options, including a percentage of the purchase price, a flat dollar amount, or an other compensation arrangement that the firm and buyer may agree to. There's also another option for a different amount if the buyer broker is a limited dual agent representing both the buyer and the seller. Note that the buyer does not automatically agree to pay the compensation that is set forth. Some buyers may not have funds to pay their broker, may be unable to pay if prohibited by their loan type, such as prior VA regulations that prohibited a buyer from paying compensation to their broker. But as far as now, the compensation since August 10th of this year has been allowed. Some buyers may be unwilling to agree to pay upfront compensation. To help in these type of situations, there's also an option to request that the seller pay any compensation that is not already covered by the seller in the listing. The seller may, but is not required to offer compensation to the buyer brokerage firm. There are different scenarios that may arise depending on the seller's offer of compensation, and a buyer may negotiate with a seller with the buyer brokerage firm's compensation addendum, also known as the Form 41C. So if the seller's offer is equal to the compensation agreed upon by the buyer's brokerage firm, then the buyer is not obligated to compensate the firm as it is covered by the seller's offer of compensation to the buyer's brokerage firm. If the seller offer is greater than the compensation agreed upon by buyer and buyer brokerage firm, there are options on how the amount is distributed. Finally, if the seller's offer is less than the compensation that the buyer and the buyer's brokerage firm has agreed to, they can directly pay any balance to the firm, or the parties can agree that as a part of the buyer's offer, they can request that the seller pay the balance. Just keep in mind that the seller is not obligated to increase their offer of compensation, and it may lead to the buyer being obligated to pay the remaining compensation balance. The compensation is always due at closing unless the parties agree to another payment arrangement in the agreement, such as an upfront fee paid to the firm. Compensation terms also contain a tail provision that may obligate the buyer to pay or owe compensation to the buyer brokerage firm if the buyer purchases certain property after the expiration of the term. Buyer will also consent to the firm receiving compensation from more than one party and to firms sharing compensation as long as the firm discloses the terms and amounts. Buyer and buyer's brokerage firms will also discuss and agree if the buyer's brokerage firm will be obligated to show properties to the buyer or not, if there is zero compensation offered to buyer's broker. The buyer's broker must bring listings to the attention of the buyer regardless of the amount of seller's offer of compensation, unless otherwise agreed to by the parties. Thank you for taking the time out to learn about the new buyer brokerage agreement requirements. Keep your eye out for my follow-up video to keep you informed, especially if you'll be buying a home soon. I hope this overview has clarified the importance and benefits of signing a buyer representation agreement. As always, My goal is to ensure that you have all the information you need as you embark on your journey to home ownership. Remember, I'm here to help you every step of the way. If you have any questions or need further assistance, don't hesitate to reach out. Feel free to contact me directly. Stay tuned for my next video where we'll continue to guide you through the ins and outs of the real estate process. Until then, happy house hunting!